Hello and welcome everyone. This is Taco Movie Talks. I'm joined here today with Matthew. Matt, how have you been this week? Have you been watching anything interesting? Been working on anything interesting? What type of movies you been watching?
Well, this week I just watched the movies that we had to do. I also just picked some random stuff that I had on my watch list that looked kind of interesting. One or a couple of Agnes Varda movies. I have seen like some of her movies before, but then a lot of them are on Criterion Channel right now, so I've kind of been looking at to find movies that are specifically on there just because of, it's easier instead of having to get it through other means a lot of the times. So,
And I've yet to watch her, but I'm a little bit familiar with her. She's pretty integral to the French New Wave movement, correct?
yes, yeah, she definitely is. She has a lot of, her movies are a lot of shorter ones, just like an hour 20, hour and a half. But they're all kind of unique in their own way, but they're definitely French New Wave-esque.
That's pretty much what you just mentioned is what I loved about Godard because I felt like I was able to watch a lot of his stuff, like four movies very quickly, and it does take like some thought as far as trying to interpret it, but it's quick, and I feel like that's the beauty. You kind of get this sense that you've had your mind stretched, but not too much with Godard.
Yeah, yeah, I like that feeling too. I like shorter stuff also because, I have to block out a longer time in my day or I have to be less busy. And then I also have to be willing to commit myself to paying attention for 3 hours. But so sometimes I really like the nice like 80 or 90-minute movies that leave a big impact. And I feel like she does a good job at that, along with a lot of that's kind of like a theme for a lot of the French Wave movies.
As far as similarities, what major similarities do you kind of find between Agnes Varda and her contemporaries within the movement? Like what distinctions do you find? Is it kind of their their use of symbolism, like surrealism, absurdism? What do you kind of find is very distinct in her films?
So for me, I'd say a lot of realism is portrayed. Also, movies about like outsiders or people who wouldn't have normally been filmed, or the films wouldn't have been as popular in the pre New Wave era. So like, there's this movie called Vagabond about that she made. That's a one I like a lot. And it's kind of about, a vagabond, someone taking odd jobs, like living on the road or on the run, whatever you want to call it. And then another central theme is she does a lot of character type movies, but they're pretty much all women characters, and that's just not something you typically see, at all. So, and the way she films it that I enjoy the most is there's a kind of like poeticism or entrancement type of feeling, different than Godard, but similar to other friend. I feel like Godard wants to take you out instead of immerse you, but I'd say she has a really cool way of filming movies that's very that looks a lot like a Godard film and like the way it things are shot, but the themes and I guess how you're supposed to enjoy the movie is different for me.
Yeah, and you kind of talk about seemingly outcasts, whether it's in the actual cinema landscape at the time that Varda was filming, and I see like kind of a parallel to one of the integral people that we're going to be talking about today, and that I think is Harmony Korine because the movie Kids 1995. I mean, he if I'm correct, was still a teenager as he was writing it, and as he acts in this film. And he's such a
Yeah,
distinct creative voice. He's just unlike anyone else in Hollywood or anyone else who's making films. Period.
yeah. He wrote this. He says, I mean, it was when he's 19. He said he was living in his grandma's basement, I think in Queens or something. And he only wrote it in, I think, a week or two, which is pretty crazy. But I think that's just how he works. But something, when rewatching it, I guess I was a little more aware of the dialogue and the script this time. Well, I'd actually seen this movie a couple times, but this time around I was focusing on it. But I realized how like funny and kind of over the top his jokes are. Like they go too far a lot of the times, but it fits with the characters and it makes for an interesting movie.
Yeah, the entirety of the movie, Kids, is um, everything really comes together to create this just crazy, unfathomable movie. Um, from the relatively unknown quantity that is Harmony Korine as a scriptwriter, and then having, I believe, the majority, if not almost 100% of the acting being from just unknowns, people without much or any acting experience, but it works together to create um, a very realistic kind of feeling of this subculture that he's trying to capture. And Larry Clark, the director, alongside with the writing, is able to capture that because of all of these kind of absurd creative choices that they took on this film.
Yeah, so Harmony was actually he moved to New York City, I think, to go to NYU, and he became friends with most of those guys that are in the movie, like the kind of random actors like Casper, Telly, all those characters. So he knew them, and think he actually wrote the script with them in mind, knowing they would be saying the lines. So he took a lot from, just hanging out with them as friends and like understanding their cadences, and the way they say things, which I think really helped like bring the characters to life and make them feel like they were real people.
Yeah, and every character is I like how fleshed out they can be, and how the time period in their lives is really illustrated in a way that kind of takes you back to that time period in your own life and reminds you how you would act with your friends as opposed to maybe how you felt about yourself as like your true self, so to speak, and how that push and pull could really impact your actions, which is just completely taken to the nth degree when we get to the end of that film, which is just so absolutely powerful. But I think I heard the kind of same telling of that story, and I read into this film because it's such an enigmatic film and so interesting on the face of it. And I think the story of how Tully was casted or imagined as the character was because he was a skateboarder in New York City, as you were talking about, and I guess he caught Harmony Korine and Larry Clark's eye because every time he would mess up a skateboard trick, he would start cussing, and for whatever reason, he stuck in their minds, and they decided this was someone who they wanted to be a central character, which just everything about it, that even that little creative decision, it just is very telling about how they went about this movie, and how every chance encounter helped create I believe a masterpiece, quite frankly.
Yeah, another reason I think I heard Larry Clark say he chose Telly is because he didn't want an attractive main character because or like a really attractive main character because he wouldn't have to be chasing girls the way Telly does in the movie. But yeah, it's I think it's interesting because the movies it has such a simple plot that's really easy to follow, but through watching it, you're kind of brought back and realizing, hey, like, oh, I remember parts in my, childhood or growing up that were like this, or I remember people that were like this. Or another thing, when you see like a party in a movie, it's it never looks like this. This feels more like a real party. It like they just brought the cameras in, instead of like it being, staged or feeling like Hollywood's idea of a party. Uh,
I completely agree. A lot of TV shows and movies, there'll be like high school parties, and they're played up like a party that a millionaire would throw. It seems extravagant, and everyone has on like, $100 shirts or dresses, and it's like no one really, I mean, unless you went to an ultra wealthy high school, and everyone in your school is just like, living in mansions. That's not what the majority of America experienced. And this party, it captures the reality of the situation, and it creates this pseudo documentary feel through doing it like that.
yeah, I feel like it in a way it could have been a documentary if it wasn't a cinematic it didn't have a cinematic narrative. Obviously a lot of things would have to change, but the feel of it is that you're watching it, them document skateboarder alternative kids in the 90s. And I did watch this YouTube video one time, and it was talking about this movie, and it uh it was comparing, the scenes in this to I think that I've never seen Clueless, and I don't really know what it's about, but there's a high school like party scene in it, and it just like side by side, the kids one just looks more real because the way the characters are interacting with each other, I'd say, is the number one thing. Somehow, I don't know how they did it, but they got them to act like they were actually partying without like as if there weren't any cameras there, because it feels like they're talking to each other, and when they're smoking pot they're doing whippets. It feels like they're just talking and you're observing, and I don't know how you get actors into that of people that haven't acted before. How you get them to basically not act for the camera is pretty impressive.
Exactly. I feel like that one obstacle in and of itself is their ability to, definitely get over that was that's super super impressive, because the way you worded it is exactly how I look at it in my mind. Just from seeing interviews from various actors, and reading, uh, it seems like the more inexperienced actor tries to act more, and I say that in quotation marks because every actor is acting, but as weird as it sounds, the more experienced you get, you are able to kind of channel it more, and have it feel as authentic as possible. And that is honestly, the challenge that you go through in your career, is making it more and more authentic. But whatever direction they were given, or how they were able to kind of set up these scenes, it really felt like they weren't acting at all, and it all came together to create these scenes that it felt like, the slice of life type feel, where you felt like you were like there spectating it. It's just crazy, crazy impressive, honestly.
Yeah, um it feels like the slice of life thing, but then it's also messed up as if you're
Mm,
like watching something you're not supposed to be, you know?
mm-hmm.
Plus the way the whole storyline plays out feels like it could be some sort of educational movie in a way. But I mean, the AIDS epidemic isn't what it used to be, but still, it could just be some cautionary tale in general.
Exactly, and kind of diving into this movie, it's something about this movie is that I really was impressed by was the weightiness of the scenes, um, from the beginning to the end. I think there's four scenes in particular that it's there's stomach churning. Well, there's a lot more than that, but there's so many scenes that it's funny because it goes from scenes that you can enjoy, and it almost is like recapturing your youth, and then at the end of it it begins to play out too long, and it starts to almost get twisted in nature. Did you kind of feel that way as well, Matt?
Yeah, and I'd say especially this like for the sex scenes. I mean,
Yeah.
especially considering they're young and it seems way too drawn out. I remember thinking like I didn't remember like this being this long. Like this is pretty uncomfortable to watch.
Yeah. And just breaking it down, uh, the kissing is drawn out, and the dialogue is crafted in a way that you you feel bad for the female characters. You want it to end. You don't want to keep watching it, but it soaks you into these scenes enough for you to get this full appreciation of the, I guess, loss of innocence, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, it is a loss of innocence in the end. And I think, I don't know because I'd heard and I watched this documentary about the making of the movie, and a lot of the actors nowadays are pretty. They don't love Larry Clark that much. They said he was kind of creepy and a little exploitative. So I wonder, I think that the drawn out scenes and the uncomfortableness is what made the movie such a big deal. But I also, wonder how much of it, maybe part of it was Larry Clark himself wanting to see these kinds of things, just because you don't really see like, teenagers, doing like with drawn out making out and like sex scenes in movies. Um, Maybe more in like European movies, but not in American movies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and another just crazy little tidbit was, like, this was maybe the first role for at least a few people who went on to have relatively successful acting careers. Obviously, you have Chloe Sevigny, um, and then you have one of the gentlemen who, for some reason, just caught my eye because he looked similar. He's one of the main characters of Scary Movie 1. And then you have that other female character. She is the other girl who gets tested for HIV, whose name I'm blanking, but she's become quite successful actor. Um, I just
Yeah, and
It's
I was
crazy how
two
successful they've become after the fact.
two of the actors are dead. If that was what a lot of the documentaries about. The guy that plays Casper, Justin Pierce, killed himself, and then Harold Hunter, who is that one of the black guys that hung out with them like in the pool scene, he
Mm.
died of a cocaine overdose. So yeah, there's been a lot of a lot of them have become successful, but then a couple of them I think kind of kept going with that lifestyle that you see in the movie because I think that was pretty much what their lifestyle was, and then I think they it just went too far.
Yeah, and the names are, it's Rosario Dawson is the female, and then John Abrahams is the male. But yeah, I had heard, I think it came up, and it was like a "Where Are They Now" video, and I think, and it was before I'd even seen the film, but I knew a lot about this film, and it was, uh, it's a very much a cult classic. I would assume it has a very strong cult audience, and one of the deaths that you were talking about, Casper's death, was one that kind of struck me, and like you said, it seemed like he had battled with addiction, and unfortunately took his own life. But yeah, it's like one of those scenarios where it's like, winning the lottery. You just by chance became friends with someone who wrote a movie, who got you in the movie, and then you are recognizable without any kind of the build up to actually get you to that point, which then would prepare you for it. You're just kind of catapulted there, and it aided a lot of these people, but also, like you said, became some of their undoings, perhaps.
Yeah, yeah. I think the whole thing about, when people get too rich and famous quick, they, move to LA and fall into bad lifestyles. I think, that was definitely the case with, the guys who passed away. Partly because, if you're already addicted to alcohol or drugs and then you get a lot of money, you're just gonna use it to buy more alcohol and drugs. It's unfortunate, but happens.
And that was something in this film that also, um, it was a bit, maybe, I don't know if disturbing is too harsh a word, but it definitely unsettled me, was all the drug and alcohol scenes when it came to their parties or just hanging out, especially with some of the characters who were depicted to be younger than the main characters, who themselves look quite young. It just, it's eye opening, and really crazy to see these kids who look like they could be like 13, 14, smoking cigarettes, joints, blunts, drinking alcohol, um, and for the film, I don't, and I want to kind of throw this to you, Matt, because this was there was almost a suspension of disbelief, borderline, where was worried that they were actually consuming these illicit substances, and alcohol, and the like. Were you feeling that as well? And did the documentary on this movie alleviate any of those concerns?
Uh, I did feel like they actually were, and I do think they actually did. If I remember what the documentary was talked about, I think that they basically were doing these things. Also, and I just look, and I just watch the movie. It's hard to like when those kids are smoking on the couch. I could tell their eyes are getting glazed and they look stoned, and you can't really fake that. And then when Casper takes a hit of or he's hitting that whippet, the balloon,
Mm-hmm.
his voice like changes pitch, which you can't like fake that. So I don't know about drinking, I think they probably were, and I think if they weren't, they were probably drunk before they came to film.
Mm-hmm.
Not maybe not hammered, but they probably had something to drink because it seems like they were, going to be doing it. They were going to be smoking and drinking with or without the camera, So I would imagine yes.
Yeah. Um, Yeah, so that is another thing that builds into this hyper realistic feel, obviously, and this film, like it struck a huge chord with me because, like, as you're growing up, peer pressure is kind of illustrated as this thing where it's someone on a corner just offers you uh, a drug, name, you know, pick any off the top of your head. But like this movie is one of the best illustrations of what that is, and it's more or less a societal pressure, which is basically just a different word for the same thing, but it's a societal expectation almost, where this certain subculture, it's very much ingrained into manhood or womanhood and the rite of passage into becoming an adult of sorts. And the way that that's baked into everything is alongside, sexual conquests. And that is the essence of this film. And its ability to illustrate that feels so raw and so real that I don't know if there's been a film to do it better, quite honestly.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you said. I think that is the definite theme of this movie. The peer pressure and, growing up, loss of innocence, getting through the rite of passage, and the sexual conquest being a big, centerpiece of that. But this is the same way you said it, just kind of in a different way. For peer pressure, I think this displays it perfectly because it's like you in order to even hang out with, be friends with these people, you pretty much have to engage in these things. And it's not like they're all saying, another way it's depicted, like everyone's trying to convince you to do something or to smoke weed or take a drug. No, it's you show up, everyone else there is doing it as well. And it would feel strange to you if you weren't because everyone's in a different state of mind. So to be there and not join in this like, not ritual but this like, party or gathering of people doing whatever things, then it's like why even be there? You're just going to, make everyone else have a bad time or you're not going to get along with them. So it's kind of like, if you want to fit in, you've got to do it, and it's more like yourself pressure is pressuring. You're feeling pressure from yourself due to the group, what the group's doing. So yeah, I think I think that's a really interesting aspect, and also I think it like shapes like their dialogue and what they're talking about, especially towards the beginning. Those scenes where they it goes back and forth from the group of guys and the group of girls, and they're both talking about like hooking up with people, but in different ways. But it, it's interesting because that is something I've never seen in another movie.
Exactly. And because these like teenage films generally focus on the male perspective, and this film actually gives the female perspective on that, and it's just the flip side of the coin. They're talking about the same thing, and just in doing so it actually fleshes out these female characters and shows how like this cycle uh begins almost, like how the the female characters are able to be taken advantage of the likes of a Tully, uh, and then how they are able to almost graduate from that experience to uh, a seemingly self-empowered type of person when it comes to their sexuality. But then that begins to it can easily, I guess, kind of take you to a place where Rosario Dawson's character was very much scared because of the HIV epidemic, and she felt empowered by her, her sexual exploits, but at the same time, it's a double edged sword, and there's just a great dichotomy between the male and the female characters, especially when it comes to the fear of HIV, which is a huge sticking point in this movie, where the males are completely unconcerned with it and the females are very much concerned with it.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that translates into real life too. In terms of the way they speak to each other about it and how they act, it it just feel or to me, I can think of people from high school that fit, almost all these characters in some way or another. Um, so just the way the characters, I guess, are written, um, is it's characters usually they kind of form, I guess, throughout the movie, or a lot of movies are great because you see a character change or develop. And in this movie, it's more like you they do develop as characters, but you already kind of have a sense for what kind of person or character or they are, and like what kind of person you might know that's similar to them within the first couple scenes of seeing them. Especially the way the movie opens and everything with Casper and Sully.
Yeah, you get an instant guttural response to Tully, and Casper is perhaps the most interesting character of this entire movie. And just because he he's the most complex of the bunch. Did was that kind of the way you saw it as well, Matt?
Yeah, I think it was too because you know, it's like he's the most respected and liked, but at the same time, you don't really understand what he wants. And I think, maybe this was similar to how he was in real life, but it seems after watching the movie, he just enjoys maybe being around his it's hard to pin it down. Being around his friends, partying and drinking a lot. Um, but he doesn't like Telly has so much more of a mission
Mm.
of just like hooking up with virgins or having sex with girls. Um, that he's much more, easy to say, oh, he's, you know, a bad person and he's super manipulative. With Casper, you feel more like he's a good person, but then at the end, you kind of all it kind of all goes into question.
Yeah, exactly. Like from the very beginning, you're conflicted by the actions that Casper takes, because he steals from a supermarket to get 40 ounces, which on the face of it is bad that he's stealing, but like there's a somewhat explanation. But then he's also like rude on top of it to the store owner, so that adds like another little wrinkle to it. And he steals a peach, but he doesn't steal the peach for himself. He ends up giving it to a little girl, and like that, I don't even know how long, maybe minute long scene. It is so telling as to the type of person he is, and it makes it really difficult to nail down what his motivations really are and who he is at the heart of him.
Yeah, and just thinking about it, while you're saying that, I think the best way is just to describe him as incredibly impulsive.
Mm.
He just always is living for right now. Considering the
Mm.
final scene and the one you just mentioned where he just takes he just did it because he wanted to, and he wasn't thinking about what he was even going to do with it, or if he even wanted it. He just saw it and he's like, I'm just going to take that, and then he did it. Which is those people with that type of impulsivity usually end up in prison because they can't help themselves from doing stuff like that. But I think that is the core of like who he is, and it's also the reason you can't really find a lot of other you know attribute, or like we were just saying, it's hard to pinpoint the rest down because it just seems to be so random because he kind of just does what he wants right then.
Yeah, you know, I think you explained it perfectly because like I was trying to figure out where his motivations lie, but truly that I think is the explanation that can cover all of the bases. Because part of me thought maybe it comes from a place where he wants to be respected by the group, and that's why he does the first thing and the last thing is stealing the 40 and then the ending scene. But impulsivity seems to actually be able to cover everything, especially these acts of kindness and these kind of atrocious acts that he commits as well. And I think Tully is possibly a person who, I think more so than the respect aspect as well, is it comes from maybe a place of power. Honestly, I think that's something that you can see through like many real people. It's having that life experience over people that you interact with and using that to your advantage. It's a power kind, like a vie for power. Like and I know a famous example I think is like Elvis Presley would I don't want to say prey because I don't think they were illegally young, but he would generally hook up with younger women from what I've read and stories I've heard, and I think it comes from a place of power. Do you have maybe your own interpretation of that, Matt, or what are your thoughts on where that comes from in Tully?
Yeah, so that is true about Elvis, um, which I didn't actually know till like maybe a year or two ago, and I was like, "What?" But anyway, yeah, I think he loves to like control and have power, and I think it's there's a couple reasons why like his whole pursuit is having sex with as many girls he can, and also like targeting virgins. And I think it does impress other guys because that seems to be what him and Casper talk about the most until he loves to brag about all the different people he slept with. Um, but also, when you were talking about the power aspect, I immediately thought of that scene where he's at the beginning when him and Casper are walking, and he's saying how he loves to have sex with virgins because they can only lose their virginity one time, and for him, like that's a important thing because they'll have him on his mind, and also he feels like he feels special for that reason. And I think another important scene about Telly is when they go into his house and you realize that his mom and his family aren't really paying attention to him and just let him go out and do whatever he wants. And so it's kind of like he grew up with his friends, not with any sort of discipline. And the end result is, you know, he ends up loving the feeling when he has power over people or when he manipulates girls, and so he just keeps doing it. And it just makes for a really hateable character because there's not a lot to like about him, but you're definitely not supposed to like him.
Mm-hmm. And there's my mind kept drifting where it's like as this character gets older, this is going to turn like it's already quite dark and sinister, but it's only going to escalate dark more to be more dark and sinister. Obviously a cinematic character, but I think that's like the places that this movie allows your mind to wander, is that like these people or movie characters feel rooted in reality, and it leads you to wonder like, man, is this how certain like, and I think everyone knows those creepy 20-year-old and maybe even getting into 30-year-old who always talk to younger girls. It's like, is this like the inception of how they come to be? But yeah, like he is such a hateable character, and you brought up another really great point where I think his family dynamic is ultimately what kind of fueled this mindset for him. And the lack of attention that he gets at home, he tries to make up for in his social life.
Yeah, yeah, and what you were saying before, I do see him as being, I guess, that creepy guy when he gets older. Maybe as he gets older, he'll continue to do it just with people that are his age. But also, as you get older, people have experienced that type of manipulation typically already. So that's, I think, part of the reason someone like him might continue to target younger people,
Mm-hmm.
because it's easy and they know how, what works. So they're just going to, keep doing that. And then it turns into being, you know, a legal issue where you're, preying on minors instead of you also being a minor.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the process can only work when if he continually moves on to the next girl. It's like he has a short shelf life for of sorts, which honestly, like I don't know, some of the especially the last girl might be so young and naive. Well, it seems like even Chloe Sevigny's character had a genuine like of him, and it could have perhaps flourished into an actual relationship, but him not talking to her is why she hates him. And I wonder if you kind of just look at the character psychology, if there's an added tide that kind of builds into this, that maybe Tully only sees himself as someone who can be loved in short doses. Just something that kind of struck me as we were talking about it, that again might be fueled by his family dynamic, where he's used to being kind of just talked to when the mom isn't nursing, and then almost forgotten about, and he expects if he stays with any one person for too long, they'll kind of discard him the same as his family.
Yeah, that's interesting. Another, I guess, perspective. I think that, in terms of the girls liking him, because this is something that popped in my head while I was watching the movie, because the way they were talking about Telly, I forgot how positive it was, and it seemed like they liked him, and I was shocked, and I was like, and then later in the movie, he's talking to, oh, I forget, you keep saying her name, but the character, and or one of the girl characters, and he's just talking up, like he's doing what people would call love bombing, or just saying all these, I love you, like I'll take care of you, all these things. And maybe it's because they're so young that this is one of their first, relationships. They're probably like, what, 15-ish in this movie, 16.
Mm-hmm.
And so they think that's how it's supposed to feel. And another thing is, I think that Telly is the type of person that just likes, who knows how, how he developed this, but he wants to be able to get a girl, and then he's kind of already moved on. So it's just kind of like a game to him, and he treats it like a game with his manipulation. And once he's, had sex with them, he's won in his mind, and he can now move on to the next person. And this is something that he hasn't had consequences for. He will, because what ends up happening in the film, or what we learn, but in the film there hasn't been consequences for his actions yet.
Yeah, exactly. And that is like almost that encapsulation of the thought where like the consequences are to come. It like strikes me in thinking of this film in a number of ways where societally watching this as a viewer, it's different from us, right? Because I was born as the year that this film came out, and I'm assuming you're around the same time. That
Yeah, well, I was also born that this year.
Yeah, exact. So if you were an adult watching this, though, I feel like there would be a bit of fear that you're like, damn, one, this seemed really realistic, and two, if this is the truth and this is kind of the culture of urban youth in major cities, like this is the generation that's coming up. And I feel like there might be a bit of fear associated with that if you're watching this, because it could lead to somewhat of a societal downfall.
Yeah, yeah, and I forget if this is in the documentary or where I saw it, but what I think it was. So when the movie came out, there were those, typical headlines on news stations that happen whenever there's some sort of culture shock where they're like, this new movie, Kids, is now banned. It's banned in all these places, and I read stories online about people who said that when they were, I guess teenagers around 95, 96, they like had to sneakily buy it and watch it without their parents knowing with their friends. So it's that kind of movie, when there's a movie that, or any kind of, artistic work that sticks out like that and can have an impact almost immediately because it spreads like wildfire. It's almost like when something goes viral today. It's kind of that same thing. Um, that I think leaves the biggest impact because not only do you have the group of people whose time it was for, which would, we would have been infants, so it wasn't for us, but we can still relate to it. So the fact that it has a giant impact on release, and then 20, 30 years later, you could still watch it and say, wow, like teenagers still act like that today is something that's super interesting, and I think also kind of goes counter to the whole like scare narrative of this generation is coming up, and we're screwed because I think oftentimes older people forget how they were when they were younger. It's just it's just how they were when they were younger. It's the 60s hippie culture, the 70s and 80s, it just in a different, they're just doing stuff slightly differently. It's just a different era.
Exactly. Like, I know when I hear tales of what my parents did growing up, it sounds absolutely ludicrous with the stuff that they could get away with, and it is crazy to think what they did and that they, like you said, grew up just the same way that we did. And I think it is often forgotten when you watch this because you're like, oh my God, they're doing X, Y, and Z, let alone almost all generations go through something like this. And also this like perfectly illustrates that time period in your life where you're almost responsibility free, where it's like summer break is essentially like, look, there's nothing on the horizon. Especially if you're not like, if you don't have a summer job, or you don't have like sports that you have to do workouts for or practices for, it's like there's just 3 months of doing whatever you can with your friends and trying to get away with as much as possible. But it's crazy because on the horizon are all of these responsibilities, but you're like still close enough to your childhood where they're not there yet, but you're trying to act like an adult but still have the freedom of being a child. And this like perfectly illustrates that.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. It's um it, I think a lot of the times the reason maybe older people don't like these kind of youth movies is just because inherently people want to be that age again. It's fun to be that age again. Uh, but they're just doing it differently than you. So it kind of upsets you a little bit, like even today, I'm not super into like TikTok and I'm only 26, but it, it's just like that whole new the Gen Z or whatever they call it, this generation. Like I'm not super into it, but I also like respect it for what it is because I know, 10 years ago we had our own versions.
Oh, absolutely. I remember distinctly there was so many headlines as to like millennials are going to be the downfall of planet Earth. And it is hilarious to see how quickly the narrative changes as the next generation begins to get older. Because now, like you said, Gen Z is getting like all of this negative, all of the same negative headlines that we were getting just like 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah, and it's funny because nowadays it's mostly just people doing stupid stuff online. For our generation too, that's almost the majority of it. But when you take it a time like this, or a time in kids in the '90s, I think something interesting. I think it was Harmony said at they did a 20-year reunion screening. He said how you couldn't make a movie like this today because the whole movie could be ended if she called Telly, or
Yeah,
text Ellie. And the whole movie is her trying to find him. It's kind of like the plot. And so it's just that was interesting to me. You can't really get lost in a movie set in today's age.
that's crazy, and I didn't even think about like that aspect of it. Is as you were saying, this couldn't be made today, just because of how ludicrous some of the choices they made are. But it's actually, yeah, the execution of it. You're right. Technology would have completely ruined this plot, but you know, in this is the perfect like '90s time capsule, quite frankly, and it works so well, and it's crazy that like just in I guess maybe like 5 or 6 years, cell phones would be essentially make a movie like this just impossible.
Yeah, yeah,
The kind of elephant in the room is the ending of this film, which if you have not seen this film yet, I think both Matthew and I would highly recommend it. Right, Matt?
yeah. Yeah. Uh, this is like I think I first watched this movie when I was in high school, and just because I was getting into mostly like Harmony Korine's movies, and I was like, wow, these are different. And I remember after I watched that, I was like, wow, this movie is so messed up. But it feels so real, and that realism is really what first attracted me to seeking out different types of cinema was because I had never seen a movie that felt like it was real life before. Most of it's a documentary, not a film. And so something that can do both and just really leave like an impact on you, and it made me way more interested in the characters' lives, the making of the movie, the directors, and those are my favorite movies when I get super intrigued about even the behind the scenes stuff, just because I, I just love everything about it.
Yeah, and like you, I stumbled upon this film. There's a YouTuber by the name of Spooky Rice. He covers disturbing movies, and this was a film that he covered. And I've watched quite a few movies that could be considered disturbing for one thing or another. And a lot of times people consider like gory movies, those are the easiest to describe as like disturbing, but a movie like Kids fits into that category because of realistic depictions of actual messed up stuff. And it's nowhere near as bad description wise as like someone being decapitated, right? Like a film like Terrifier 2, Terrifier 1 gets this title of being disturbing, but a film like Kids is, I think, more disturbing for me because of what you just explained, Matt. It's the realistic depiction that it hits me 10 times harder because you can't separate yourself from the film as easily.
Yeah, just going off what you said, I think for me, it's I have never, thankfully, grown up in an area where I'm seeing extreme violence everywhere or people, getting murdered. And so there's nothing I can really relate to. I feel like, maybe if I had been involved in a mafia or some kind of gang when I was younger, Italian gang, then those maybe Italian gangster movies might mean more to me,
Mm-hmm.
in a certain way. But because almost every high school has groups of people that act like this, whether it's a lot or just, one or two cliques, there's usually a group of people that are going to be acting similar to the kids in this movie. So, and you can think about times in your life that were like this. For me, thankfully, and I probably a lot of people, you can't relate as much to extreme violence.
Exactly. And man, it this film it hit me hard, and in the script writing is where this movie really shines with its impactful moments. And I almost erroneously said that there's four impactful moments and then later kind of recanted. There's a ton of very impactful moments, but four in particular, or just a few, is the beginning scene with Tully and a girl, then another scene with Tully and a girl, then we have the middle scene and the ending scene. And all of the scenes after this middle scene get completely almost reshaped in your mind as a viewer. And this is the big spoiler of this movie, so this is the last chance. If you haven't seen it, go and watch it. But it's when Chloe Sevigny's character finds out that she is tested positive for HIV. And that completely reshapes the first scene, completely reshapes the scene where Tully is having sex with a second person that day, and then it completely reshapes the scene in which Casper sexually assaults Chloe Sevigny's character.
Yeah, that's like that's it's funny because that's like the most. I mean, the scenes themselves are super uncomfortable, but when you add that in and that he's spreading, uh, at the time at least, deadly STD, it's you're just like wow because the scene of her Chloe Sevigny's character in the back of the cab when she's sad and he's asking her, I think he asks her, oh, like what's bothering you, like school, or and he says one other thing, and you realize that those problems are like absolutely nothing, that they're nothing in comparison to what she's going through, and to even try and like if to try and grasp what someone that age would be going through, that's similar to contracting HIV, is it's nuts. That's like the true weight of the film right there. And you realize that I guess all there is a consequence for these characters just acting hedonistically, um, which I guess is kind of the cautionary tale
Mm.
aspect of the movie.
Yeah, exactly. And I love like real hyper realistic films that are able to do that. And I don't know if this film is able to hit the mark as realistically as this film, but I guess just two that come to mind is that feel very, very effective as far as cautionary tales is Train Spotting and Requiem for a Dream. And
Yeah,
I love those films, and those feel like that's what they should be showing in Dare. I like those legitimately, even at older ages. It's like, damn, like there are true consequences to this stuff, and you look at it as a game when you're growing up, but it really hits you hard, and for a certain aspect it makes you feel lucky that you were able to get out unscathed because you go through this same time period yourself.
yeah. That's I was just thinking about that because as I've grown up and seen people, I of course I've been involved in partying and stuff myself, mostly in college, not high school. But you go through and you see some people don't make it out, and that is the reality. Whether accidentally overdosing on something, or you go so far and you end up in rehab multiple times, and your life just doesn't get back on track, which is kind of this circular kind of depressive aspect on people's lives. It's like they fall into the to an addiction or something, and then that destroys them, and then they try and get back up and they can't, and so they turn back to drugs or alcohol because it helps them. And so I think this movie for kids would be, I think, the most effective. I think I love Train Spotting and Requiem for a Dream, and I think those are great um, movies about drug use and being cautious. Um, but but for something I think would have had the most impact on me when I was 15, I think it would definitely be this movie,
Mm.
just because of how much I would have been able to uh, relate to it. But I think in terms of Train Spotting and Requiem for a Dream, I think those do a better job at showing an addict, and I think
Mm-hmm.
that this movie does a better job of just showing that like teenage party culture, I guess the best way to say it.
Mm-hmm. No, I completely agree with you. It's the Train Spotting and Requiem definitely feel like maybe someone who has experimented with drugs, who's more at a more like a later station in their life, it could kind of connect more with them. Whereas kids, if you're watching that as someone who's actually in high school, you you probably feel immediately connected to these characters. They probably speak the same dialect that you do, and then to see how and it plays more towards the sexual angle than anything else, because you don't get to see how the drugs and alcohol can relatively affect them, at least in the long term. But you can see how the hedonistic lifestyle can. Like there's an immediate kind of effect where, they've actually contracted a life threatening virus. And kind of going back to you on at least those last two scenes, I don't know which one hit me harder. The scene where Chloe Sevigny watches Tolly with another girl who up until this point is she's I think depicted as a 13-year-old girl in the movie, or the scene where Chloe Sevigny is sexually assaulted, because both really are a gut punch and very almost difficult to watch, especially the last scene. But they're kind of different feels, but they're both difficult as hell.
Yeah. For the scene you mentioned, not with Chloe and Casper, that one for me is super uncomfortable just because she's obviously not really enjoying it, and feels like you're watching like a messed up like rape scene kind of. Even though I guess the scene with Casper is technically more of rape because she's not even conscious. Um, but also, maybe the one with Casper ends up hitting just a little harder just because, his character, Tully's doing something you knew he would keep doing. And
Mm,
Casper, you're like, why is he doing this? And
hmm.
it's never explained. You don't really know.
I agree with you. That last scene almost, it's like the absolute corruption of that character, Casper, and that in and of itself, despite all of the outside variables that add onto that add layers to that scene, in and of itself, just seeing someone who is kind of teetering the line between good and bad, just completely going into the camp of like a despicable human being and committing a disgusting act is what really hits hard in that scene.
Yeah, because it's like seeing Telly be like, oh, I expect that. But then you like Casper up until that point. He doesn't really, I mean, he does hurt people, but it's kind of in a comical way. Like even though he's mean, to the gas station, or the food mart guy, it's kind of funny, but Telly's just kind of evil. And then when Casper does it at the end, you're just like, this character I liked, I can't really like him anymore. But then when you see people talk about the movie online, you see people still like Casper. So it's very confusing.
And that this might be an added aspect of where the kind of peer pressure that we were talking about earlier played into it, because I feel like Casper had maybe seen Tully as like surpassing him in social standing, and that like his inability to be successful with women the same way that Tully was, like it was impacting his self-image, and in a like in the most disgusting way to go about it, felt like it was the only way to almost stay friends with Tully and be on a similar level, as if he was able to hook up with Chloe Sevigny despite the fact she was passed out. I don't know if you kind of saw it that way either, but I felt like that, on top of his impulsivity, played a factor into why he acted that way.
Yeah, yeah. Because guys this age, this teenage age, not everyone, but a lot of people, they like compete in this like sexual way like that. Like who can hook up with whatever girl and how many girls. And it's like a contest, and like a kind of like a game, like we've been talking about. And I think that there are a few times I noticed, and I remember thinking about it, and when I was watching the movie again, that you know they'll be talking about sleeping with girls or some part of that, and Telly's always bragging, and Casper is saying things as if, he's also sleeping with girls all the time, but you don't see it like you do see it with Telly. So you wonder if there's something in the back of his mind where he doesn't feel like he's up to Telly's standards. And I think it's interesting that, I think Casper is obviously supposed to be the more attractive looking and likable one, but in the end, Telly sleeps with more girls because he seems to know exactly who to target
Mm.
and exactly what to say. Well, like I remember they exchanged dialogue one time, and Casper's like, you would, for someone who's only 13, and it just seems
Mm.
a little like he finds that strange, but he doesn't really tell Telly that, but you can kind of see through the way he's saying it that he does think it's a little weird, but Telly just doesn't care.
Yeah, that complete shamelessness, and it just on top of I would imagine being a sociopath is what allows Tully to be more successful in this weird kind of gray area that creates this that is ever present in this kind of subculture. It's altogether just so interesting, illuminating, and just well crafted. Matt, I want to ask you if you have any final thoughts on this movie, as well as your rating.
Well, I think we went through all the parts of this movie, pretty detailed. So I enjoyed that. Oh, one thing I wanted to remember mentioning that I never got to talk about. If you didn't notice, and I didn't notice this until I saw someone post it, I think, not even a year ago, but the guy that gets hit with the skateboard that they almost killed, that's Dave Chappelle. Um,
No
like,
way.
yeah. And then when I was watching it, I was like, "Oh my gosh, that is him." Yeah. Uh, but for rating, it's a 5 out of 5 for me. This is one of those movies that I will never forget. Has a big impact on what movies I like and getting into cinema and all that. So it's important to me.
Yeah, I'm still blown away that was I don't know how the hell I didn't recognize him.
I don't know either.
Holy crap, that's crazy. Honestly, I wonder how he even got casted, or how he knew Larry Clark or Harmony Korine. That is insane. I give this one a 4.5. I think it's a masterpiece. It's amazing cinema, and when you kind of said this is like under the premise of like coming of age, not having seen this but knowing the quote unquote disturbing aspects of this film, I was really interested how it would play into that, and it truly is. It's it's a realistic display of coming of age, and all of the it shows it warts and all too, and that's the beauty of the film is it's an unflinching look at this subculture at this age, and the youth of this time period and of this area, and it's like it's just brilliant. It's amazing.
Yeah, my favorite cult classic, I think.
The next movie is kind of on the flip side, uh, where you have I think he's considered a Hollywood brat, which is kind of this group of filmmakers that really came into being in the early 1970s. Francis Ford Coppola and his film Rumblefish, which is another coming of age film that has the tale of a high school kid who it starts out with him in a fight, and beyond that it's him almost trying to find his way, where he had kind of built up what his experience would be like in high school, but it's like the changing of the guard as far as culturally what it is like growing up in his time period as opposed to his older brother's time period. And it almost leaves a vacuum to where a person like him not only has to live in the shadow of his brother, but there's not quite a place for him. Was that kind of the way that you looked at this film, Matt, in terms of Matt Dillon's character?
Yeah, it's kind of like his brother comes back and he's more than a legend in the town. And and it's kind of like it's definitely a different story of coming of age. It's more about the passing of an era, I would say, or how
Hmm.
things change in a town as opposed to what we were, kids is more like this is what an era is like. It's not the
Hmm.
change or the passing. It's like full throttle dive into mid 90s Brooklyn, New York skate culture. This is like a more, but a tale of growing up a little more, and I would say.
I completely agree. And that's the best way to not only compare it to kids, but like the story isn't just a day in the life of, you're seeing how the actual landscape is impacting Matt Dillon in affecting his future decisions, but and also his search for the answers, so to speak. And I found that really interesting. In this film, altogether, when you kind of, from the films I've seen from Francis Ford Coppola, like this feels like The Outsiders with some of the artistic nature that you see more so in like, you see dashes of it in Dracula, and you see heavier doses of it in Apocalypse Now. It definitely has that like high art nature to it. It has that artistic nature to it, and it has a tremendous cast on top of it. But it has that kind of grounded, coming of age and tale of a youth that you see in The Outsiders as well. So it was like a complete amalgamations of all the works I'd seen of Francis Ford Coppola up until this point, and was very interesting for sure.
Yeah, I saw The Outsiders too, and I think both of these are kind of grouped, I would say, together. Like they would be talked about when you're talking about Coppola movies similarly. And uh, part of the reason I liked this movie more is just because, like you were saying, how it kind of feels art house and
Mm.
it's arts, and a lot of that for me comes from the way it's filmed, how foggy it is, how the way he uses color with the fish, um, and it's so smoky, and you get this atmospheric sense of this kind of middle America uh town where, there's a lot of maybe, alcoholics, or like his dad, and a lot of more working class people, but it feels also kind of 50s and 60s ish with uh the way the characters are dressed and act. Maybe that, there's like leather, they're kind of motorcycle gang type of people, but I guess it's maybe the way that they interact with the girls and the romance and the way the interiors are designed that makes me think 50s and 60s.
I agree, and I almost feel like it was all intentional. When it comes to even costume changes and the way that this was filmed, it feels like a distant memory, and in so doing that, it feels like they wanted to make it look like that, and the reasoning stems back from what you were talking about, where it's like talking as an era is changing, it's almost looking back at a bygone era. And it's quite interesting. I love when directors can do that, literally use visual aspects of a movie to accentuate a point they're trying to make thematically. And like Tarkovsky is amazing at that. And it wasn't literally until you were kind of bringing it up, but I think that is ultimately like what Coppola was going for with the look of this film.
Yeah, yeah, it's you know, I guess when you said Tarkovsky, it does remind me in a way of that. Maybe it's just because the hazy, smoky look of all of it,
Mm-hmm.
and it also, something I noticed on the rewatch was the use of music and just sound effects, kind of in different
Mm.
parts of the film that might make something seem more. It changes the tone. So a lot of times, for example, I was in the fight, where the guy pulls the knife, and the motorcycle boy ends up riding in. Like the beginning, when he says like, "Oh, he's looking all geeked out." The guy Matt Dillon's gonna fight, and then it erupts into this big, super unrealistic type of battle, and it's almost like fantasy esque.
Mm.
It almost, it makes it kind of. And then after that, I started noticing more how it felt like there was some sort of magic underlying it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about that. And Motorcycle Boy was almost painted as like a superhero esque type of character. It all felt like the like honestly, part of me was wondering, is this all a real depiction, or are we meant to think that parts of this film are supposed to be like the dream of a character? It had me questioning the reality of the situation constantly.
Yeah, yeah, me too. And then, the other big aspect that, for some reason I just find so there's only a couple of other movies that do this, but just the way the fish light up. Um and then you kind of see the black and white, and it's like I don't know what that's supposed to symbolize, the fish being in color, but that's just another thing that really stuck out as turning it into some sort of magical fantasy type of movie. It also, the way Motorcycle Boy is truly like a larger than life type of character. And so when he, well, part of the way the movie is showing change is showing how, he doesn't really, although he's loved, he can't really do what he used to. And it really creates this situation for Matt Dillon's character, where he's kind of lost, and it's like he doesn't have his own sense of self because he's so reliant on his brother.
Yeah, and that was like a huge sticking point that uh, I felt very strongly from this movie, that such a big part of the character of Matt Dillon's character was that he looked up to his brother, but I almost without his knowledge was living under his shadow, which is something that generally both in real life and in media is something that causes that person to resent the person casting the shadow. But he is just as much in awe of Motorcycle Boy as even more so even than the people around him. There's other people who start to look at Motorcycle Boy as almost sad in some ways, while Matt Dillon is just completely entranced by him. But another thing that I wanted to throw in there was the use of color was very effective, and I also didn't completely understand what the what it was trying to point towards. And I the other time I noticed it was as you got to the end of the film, there was flashes from Matt Dillon where things, the entire screen would be in color at times. And I rack my brain, and I don't have any completely grounded theories, but it's definitely interesting, and I would be all ears to any theories about that.
Yeah, I don't know. When I was, this is going to be like a super surface level type of, symbolism theory, but for whatever reason, he wants to release all the animals at the end.
Mm.
And, when they see the fish together, it's super special and important. And it's this like surreal, serene type moment of the movie where, it's like they seem like they're truly happy. And, I don't know if, I mean, the answer isn't, that animals just bring them joy, because that's, dumb. But I wonder if they're just maybe looking for peace or something. Do you have any ideas? I don't know.
So, and it might be just all gobbledygook, but Motorcycle Boy, who, by the way, I want to throw out, I was shocked when I saw it was Mickey Rourke, because I had only seen films with Mickey Rourke in like the 2000s, and I was just so accustomed to seeing him looking entirely different than this. But he says that he sees life as like colorblind and that everything looks black and white to him. And I think we are also supposed to look at it through Matt Dillon's eyes almost this entire film. And I think it's to kind of depict that he's completely following in his footsteps, and as that breaks, it's supposed to cue us in as to the significance of the fish, that they're like completely boxed in to be in just this one tank. They can't interact with the other fish because of their nature and what they're expected to act like, a lot like Matt Dillon, and that it begins to break and we begin to actually see color once Motorcycle Boy has his fate kind of decided for him. That altogether, I think it's like that he hasn't been set free of kind of following in the same footsteps as his older brother. And I think there's a lot more to it than that, but that was really the only thing that I could kind of connect it to.
Yeah, actually, that sounds, you know, right. I think what I took the most from that is um, how the nature of the fish
Mm,
that you were saying, how, the way they live and how they would kill each other if they were in the same tank. And, I think that, we're on a theme again about the way that, younger people act, even though this isn't a super realistic movie. It's kind of like dreamy, like you said. It kind of is like a dream, and it's kind of like these bigger themes that are being focused on. One seems to be, as we were talking about things passing on, but I think another, or times changing. But I think another uh, important part is their attitudes, and you got their dad who isn't really there. I mean, he
mm,
is, but mentally not really. And the mom not really, and then it's kind of like they already had a life growing up, kind of like maybe we see in the movie Kids, in terms of drug, alcohol, because they're characters are shooting heroin up in this movie. um and it's kind of like what happens once you're in your 20s and you're a legend in your hometown. But really, like, are you much of an individual outside of that? Well, Tim Dillon's character thinks you're like the greatest, but everyone else, is kind of like, that's not in that little group from your hometown, doesn't really care. And then so a lot of those, big people similar to Motorcycle Boy end up, shooting up heroin and stuff all the time.
yeah, exactly. And I felt like that was something that was probably like an unspoken thing with Motorcycle Boy as well, that perhaps he felt like his life was like almost at a point of no return. But one of the most interesting aspects of this film to me was the difference of perspective between the the outside audience, Motorcycle Boy himself, and Matt Dillon. And Matt Dillon obviously was in awe of his older brother, but there was talks that a lot of people saw Motorcycle Boy as being insane, which was really interesting how that kind of developed and evolved, and also how Motorcycle Boy saw himself as like not a great influence for Matt Dillon as well, and was very cryptically kind of warning him that, especially like with the whole Pied Piper discussion, that he realized he wanted to be a leader so badly, like Motorcycle Boy was, yet Motorcycle Boy realized he didn't have anywhere to go, and that maybe Matt Dillon should A, stop following Motorcycle Boy, and B, not be a leader himself until he actually has a destination in life. I, all of that I found extremely interesting.
Yeah, and you know, you don't really know if Matt Dillon learns, but what happens at the end, you could assume he's probably learned something. But there it's interesting because Matt Dillon's character, unlike the other movie we were discussing, he's he does want power, but it's kind of hard to say like how or why or in what sense he's trying to get that because it, it's it's like he looks up to Motorcycle Boy so much, and does he really want anything but to just hang out with his brother? It doesn't really give you a lot of other things to think about in terms of his character, like what are his goals and motivations. When I think of the movie, I can't really think of any besides you know his getting his group ahead of the other group or beating them and get a gang war or something like that.
Yeah, I agree. And part of me wonders if if maybe it was something that they were trying to subtly tell, or if it just didn't get fleshed out enough to fully land. But I remember there was a scene in which Motorcycle Boy told Matt Dillon about kind of a childhood trauma that really impacted his psychology, where he was left alone, and that has kind of led for him to always have a need to be around people. And I wonder if how deeply that has affected his inner motivations as to why he looks up to his brother, because he doesn't want to lose him again, and he has that need to just like cling on to him because he's afraid to lose him because it makes him one step closer to being alone. And if that also impacts his drive to become just like him, because perhaps he wants other people to look up to him and constantly be around him because he's this larger than life character. I don't I don't know. What are your thoughts, Matt?
Yeah, so an interesting thought I just had that I think maybe will articulate what my thoughts were a little better. So I think that Matt Dillon's character, it has this obsession with trying to be like his older brother, Motorcycle Boy, who he sees as a hero. And so, he's always trying to be the leader. And then, like someone like Nicholas Cage's character, I think if I remember right, at one point straight up tells him he wouldn't be good at the job. And he seems, not as maybe not as intelligent or not as equipped to be a leader like his older brother was. And then you see his older brother as like this mystique, mystical figure. And part of the reason that he seems to be so hailed, or maybe it's not part of it, but maybe it keeps, Matt Dillon's character loving him even more, is that Motorcycle Boy doesn't seem to want to be the leader he is, and he doesn't think he deserves it either. Um, he doesn't really want to be like a parent figure to Matt Dillon's character either. Um, he he just kind of looks like he's like floating through life, not really doing a lot, yet he's having people attracted to him, or at least these people from his hometown. And maybe Matt Dillon is just kind of, or Matt Dillon's character is just a little jealous of that aura the Motorcycle Boy holds. I don't know if jealousy is the right word, but he envies him at the same time as he really respects him.
And that's like an additional aspect that I actually really like about this movie is that they paint these very nuanced characters, and you really you describe them all quite perfectly. Like Motorcycle Boy, the way they depict him throughout gives him this great mystique, and they're all these flawed, a flawed hero in Motorcycle Boy, flawed hero in Matt Dillon's character, and that he doesn't have all of the aspects that you would want in a hero, and yet he's still like fighting a hero's battle, so to speak. He's constantly trying to prove himself. And then even if you look at a character like Nicolas Cage, who is, you know, on the more villainous side of the spectrum, he's not a black and white villain. He's actually very human in nature, and isn't even necessarily a bad guy. He just kind of does something that you wouldn't associate with loyalty. And that also, I think, is a huge aspect that they bring up in the film, where one of the characters, it might have been Dennis Hopper, I'm not exactly sure, but they say that Matt Dillon's fatal flaw is loyalty. And that actually does kind of come to pass, where his life is weighed down throughout this movie by loyalty, and only after the climax are we able to see a scenario in which he might be able to overcome that.
Yeah, I think that's true about his character. You know, he's completely loyal to Motorcycle Boy, and it's as if he tries to lead himself, it would he would just be constantly thinking, "What would Motorcycle Boy do?" Which doesn't make him a leader. Um, and I think another uh, interesting thing is how they don't like. It's almost as if Matt Dillon's character is worshiping him when they're together, and as if Motorcycle Boy doesn't care, even though you could tell he cares and he loves his brother. It's very one sided, and they don't even really bond uh, and have that moment of where you typically see in a movie like this, before the events at the end unfold, where they're kind of like where Motorcycle Boy maybe would say something like, give him a talk about how he needs to step in his shoes or something like that. You don't really see that. Motorcycle Boy's kind of just living, going where he wants. And I just had another thought about how that's kind of also similar to those fish, because I think he says something about how they need to have more room to live. And
Mm-hmm.
I think he might see himself like that, where he's trapped in this town, or he had come back from somewhere else, and maybe when he came back he realized, you can't just be stuck in this one town. Even if you're hailed as some kind of hero, you have to kind of go out and explore.
I agree, and you kind of pointed something out, which is it was really interesting in watching, in that Motorcycle Boy kind of had an ambivalent relationship with Matt Dillon, in that throughout I almost waited and expected a turn to come, where there would be a time where Motorcycle Boy lashes out and that creates the big conflict of the film, but that never happens. Motorcycle Boy, he just kind of lives and just is, and is even, he passes along knowledge to Matt Dillon that is very insightful about himself, and then, even compliments him and reassures him. And it's very, very unformulaic. It's very unique in their relationship with each other, because it pushes the plot along in a way that isn't so direct.
Yeah, like you don't really know where it's going to go or end up, which there's good and bad things about that, but typically movies like that I stay more engaged in, as long as it's what's happening isn't boring. If it's keeping me entertained on screen, and I also don't know where it's going, then that usually makes it better. Because there were a few moments, a few times where they get into altercations, and I wasn't sure if who could die or what could happen to the different characters, because it seemed as though Matt Dillon or Motorcycle Boy's character could die and the movie could still go on in some way.
Yeah, exactly. And that kind of brings to a very critical point in this movie, which if you haven't seen it, again, this is probably the one spoiler from this movie, but I want to bring it up so I could ask you a question, Matt, which is Motorcycle Boy has kind of this antagonistic relationship with the police officer of the town. Because he's kind of a rebel, and I think the police officer sees that he could potentially influence people to try to follow in his footsteps, a la Matt Dillon, which leads to the climax of the film, where when Motorcycle Boy is trying to free these fish, he is shot and killed. And as we were talking, it wasn't something that struck me while I was watching, but it only struck me now as we were talking. Do you think that the action on the part of Motorcycle Boy was possibly with the intention of either being locked away for a long time or even killed as a way to free Matt Dillon in a very, very profound way because of how loyal he was to Motorcycle Boy, and maybe the revelation that he would not be able to break from that while Motorcycle Boy was alive?
Yeah, I think that's possible. A lot of just because he seems so depressed and nonchalant the whole movie. Motorcycle Boy does, in the way that seems like something his character would do. Some kind of act of not telling you to your face, what you feel or what you're gonna do, but doing some kind of action like that, and in his head he's thinking, well, if I were to die here, then at least he learned this or this would happen. I think that's very possible.
And I have to speak to the character of the Motorcycle Boy, where the way he's written and depicted and acted, they are able to navigate like such a fine balance of that character, because I think a very soft spoken and cool character like that would be easy to not capture correctly and come off not the way it's intended, but I think it comes off perfectly where Mickey Rourke does, he epitomizes cool in this film, at least on my viewing. He captures a mystique, like you said, and most importantly is he almost seems like he is able to like pick up on things that are almost outside of what everyone else is able to like understand. Like he has a greater understanding of maybe life in general or people's situations. Like he almost has this sense of wisdom to him. Did you kind of feel that way too?
Yes, and what that description just made me think about was how he's similar to a lot of the Western heroes we've been seeing in our Western films we've watched, like John Wayne characters. They don't talk a lot. They there's more done through their actions. They have a sense of mystique and mystery about them, and it's usually like part of the town considers them a menace, and the other part hails them as a hero. And it's the kind of that same sort of um, soft spoken, wise leader caricature. And we have that here, but you don't really see a lot of why. In westerns it's usually because they're really good with a gun. Here, it's kind of a little more questionable. It's because you don't really see how he did what he did to be so have everyone so in awe of him, including the police. Obviously, that means he's probably doing some illegal things, but clearly he's respected, just like the outlaws.
Yeah, exactly. And I I kind of like that there was like the interactions between Matt Dillon's character and the girlfriend that of Motorcycle Boy, and that was like a very telling scene of some of the literal jealousy. I think between someone who could potentially come between Matt Dillon and Motorcycle Boy, but also I wonder if that speaks to, because I don't know. You said something, and it further kind of pushed a point in my head that she could have been almost symbolic of Motorcycle Boy falling into a heroin dependency himself. And the way you spoke of it made me think, was that something that you kind of thought yourself that perhaps Motorcycle Boy was using as well?
Yes, I think he is, because I think his character, just like he's like this celebrity, this worshipped person in the town and by people. And I think when he comes back, it's almost like they summoned an old hero, like Batman or something out of the night sky, and he just shows up, but he's different. And I think what they're trying to say it a lot in the story is how maybe this is how people we see as heroes really are. And I think that the heroism addiction not only goes with his actual character from the movie, growing up uh, as a poorer town with bad parents, and only being loved in the town, and then you grow up and you leave. A lot of those people end up getting into something like a heroin addiction, uh, just because it just kind of is not only associated with that character, but I think it's associated with the whole idea of like celebrity and that we have. These people we consider larger than life, and then when they end up, being something like a heroin addict, you start to realize how they're just real people.
Yeah, and the analogy that you used, it made me realize that this is like a template that you could easily transfer over to like a different setting. Like you could make a movie that follows this same beats. Like if someone was an actor and looked up to a friend that was a big movie star who under it all was truly unhappy with who they were despite all of the accolades and fans that they had. And I think it's like it's very interesting to kind of look at it that way, and that this kind of characterization or this plot and premise could easily be transferred to like a different kind of story where you make the characters maybe an actor as opposed to a high schooler. That it's really it speaks to how true these dynamics can be.
And yeah, it takes that celebrity topic, or celebrity worship, and it kind of puts it more on a relatable level. At least for me, I didn't grow up in a town like this, but it was small enough to where we didn't really have like people kind of like Motorcycle Boy, where the whole town knew him. But there are people like that they have a status, in the town, and everyone kind of knows of them in some way. And I think most people, can relate to that.
Yeah, and especially from discussions that I've had with you and from where I grew up, uh, I think a lot of that can be baked into athletics, where if
Yeah.
someone's like a terrific quarterback, they live in the minds of that town, for years after they graduate. And there could be people who try to emulate them after the fact, and people probably look up to them while they go to school with them. And it's a lot more relevant and relatable than the story is on the face of it.
Yeah, yeah, and I could say, from experience, there's a kid in my middle and high school who's in the NFL now, and I could say that that worship is definitely there, for football, especially in Texas.
Yeah, I mean it's insane. Um, like our school, there was a guy. There's I think he's maybe the only one, or maybe there's one other person who went to my high school who made it to the pros, and like he's a household name in our town. If you ask anyone like, "Hey, do you know so and so?" Everyone knows his name, and he still lives close to this town, and anytime you see him, you know who he is. And as I was growing up, because my mom was a preschool teacher, she had his kids and asked him like, "Hey, can you sign this picture for an autograph?" And we had a picture of this guy playing football autograph from him. Like that's how deeply it can live. But that's the bright side of how that can end up, and you can motivate kids. I think athletics innately has like a positive spin on it, because it you are active in trying to you're physically active to try to replicate what they did, and it makes you try to aspire. But at this time period, for a lot of towns, perhaps a person like Motorcycle Boy, like in the 50s, 60s, borderline into the 70s even, he could be looked upon in a better light than maybe a successful athlete in certain towns. And that spin on this story is what makes it so interesting, because there's pitfalls that are innate to a person like Motorcycle Boy.
Yeah, yeah, and time period too is another thing. I think even though this came out in the 80s, I'm almost sure this is supposed to be set in the 50s. And I think there's that whole American, idea that we have of like what a suave, cool person in, a 50s American suburban town was like. And I think that Motorcycle Boy comes maybe a little rougher version of like the all American boy, but he kind of has that coolness to him.
Yeah, yeah. He like I know I already said this, but this could have been. Honestly, I don't know who could have played this character better than Mickey Rourke, because I think in the wrong hands, it would have came off laughably bad. And there was even times where I'm almost like scratching my chin, and I'm like, there is something innately cool about this guy, and you just he's likable despite there not being anything like on the face of it that he does that's like considered good.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, is he? I was trying to see what other movies Mickey Rourke was in. I guess he's in Buffalo '66, but I wasn't sure what he was famous for.
Is he really in Buffalo 66?
Yeah, I just checked on Letterbox. I don't think he's. Oh, he's just a small character. What is he famous for?
He was in The Wrestler, and he's also the villain in Iron Man 2.
Oh, okay. It's been a long time since I've seen Iron Man 2, but I didn't know that.
And like it's crazy because I don't know if you can picture him in your head right now, but he was like an older dude with gray long hair, mustache, super tan skin, and his face looks like I'm looking at a picture of Motorcycle Boy right now, and it's insane to think like that's what he looks like in like 20, 30 years.
Oh yeah, so he's one of those people that looks different. I think someone that else that does that, another actor. I think William Dafoe is really he kind of looks the same, but he's been in movies for me before, and I haven't recognized him. He's someone that I think is good at blending in.
And he's an amazing actor. And I don't know, just to bring up a current kind of topic, not to get too off tangent, but he's supposed to be in the new Nosferatu movie, but that Robert Eggers is supposedly working on. I don't know if you heard about that, but I would love to see. And I know he already plays Nosferatu in a movie, but I would love to see William Dafoe play Nosferatu in a Robert Eggers movie.
Yeah, that would be great. I think I heard something about that, but honestly, he would be the first director I would choose to do another Nosferatu movie. Just I loved William Dafoe in The Lighthouse too, and I thought, I really like Eggers' his aesthetic. I guess he's the one director I think that could use black and white still today and for a purpose. And I think it. But the funny thing is that it's completely different than this movie's use of black and white. I think Rumblefish is more like let's say German expressionism, like the original Nosferatu movie, like the shadows, the darkness, the fog. It feels like steamy and dreamy, which in a way, Eggers is kind of like that, but I feel like his is a little more. I don't know. How would you describe it? Because there's a difference.
It gives his films almost an edge, if that makes any sense. It gives it a darker tone. It feels like it plays into giving a sense of danger almost in that it's not so much shadows, but it's the starkness of colors is like instantly it's almost stunning visually to look at it, that the stark contrast of everything. That's the best way I could describe it, but it makes it very interesting, and it almost gives you a sense of like the universe. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then I feel like I feel like Rumblefish is like that, but I think I, I don't like playfulness or however you want to describe it, the fantasy element, and like mostly coming from the soundtrack, and also the way it's shot in the black and white smokiness isn't make it feel a little edgier or like darker, kind of like in an Eggers movie, but it still feels a little more lighthearted.
I agree with everything you said, especially like the fantasy element, the steam, and there's one specific scene that I remember seeing where it almost looked like it was whenever like the sky was moving at like 10 times speed, and the person in front of it was standing still, and it all like added to this ethereal feeling, very dreamlike, and like it was indeed like a fantasy of someone, where it's like this is how they interpreted the events, but it wasn't down to the letter true to reality.
Yeah, yeah. So I don't know. I feel like we've discussed most of what the movie's about, and I'm not sure how that really adds to it in a way. The thing I can think of is the fact that Motorcycle Boy is basically a larger than life character, and so maybe his whole return and the whole worship of him and Matt Dillon's relationship with him when he returns. You could also argue that this is just a dream for Matt Dillon, and he's his brother never really came back, but he ends up, I guess, in the end learning something from his brother coming back and losing him. Maybe that he learns to lose his attachment. Obviously there's no indication that this is a dream, but maybe it's that maybe that is somehow the mystical or magical element.
I agree with you. I think the two major ways that would be like the most productive to look at it would either be the events did unfold, and that this is Matt Dillon's maybe like look back, and like he from the very beginning of this like retelling had left, or like you said, it never played out, but this was like the mental, like what he had to go through mentally to get to that station finally. I think those are the two uh, best ways to kind of look at what this movie's trying to tell and why that depiction is this way.
Yeah, yeah.
So Matt, I want to ask if you have any final thoughts on this film, and as well your rating on this film.
Final thoughts would be, I think, this and the other movie are two very different but great coming of age films. I don't know if they're supposed to be meant for teenagers, but even if you're older than a teenager, I would say I'd appreciate it more now than when I was a teen, just because you can look back and relate a lot of the stuff to what happened in your life and not what you're currently going through. Um, but I gave this movie 4.5 out of 5 stars. This actually might be, I haven't seen all of them, but yes, this is a controversial opinion, but I like this movie more than Apocalypse Now. So just barely, but I do.
I and I've said this time and time again, I think my appreciation has grown for this film. When I first watched it, there was a lot of sections that they didn't make all of the sense to me at the time. Upon talking to them, talking about them, it's a much clearer picture in my head. Like the whole ending didn't make sense to me at the time, but after talking to you, I was able to kind of see your perspective and then kind of help formulate something that did make sense. So, if I were to rewatch this, it would probably go up, but my current rating is a 3.5 out of 5. Ultimately, very, very good, and I think with this knowledge, I think people's appreciation of it might also, be more so. Um, Apocalypse Now, that I don't know what I would rate it. It's been so long and I never rated it after like a fresh watch. That's one that I definitely have to watch again. And this is a very interesting film, and it makes me want to watch Dracula again too, because it makes me wonder if there was some things that I kind of missed.
Dracula. Wait, I'm sorry. What are you?
Just
Is that a
because,
Coppola?
yes, yeah.
Oh, okay. I just haven't seen that one. Sorry, I wasn't familiar.
Yeah, and it doesn't, it's only like, how visually this has a very artsy nature to it. So too does Dracula. Um, and I just wonder if there was a lot of kind of interpretive choices made that I missed on the face of it, because my rating for that was it was a lot lower than a lot of other people's. So I'm not, maybe I missed something.
Yeah, I've seen The Godfather. I actually never saw part two, and I think that's another one I need to rewatch. Maybe his Coppola's movies are just maybe harder to get into the first time, but I mean, The Godfather's like the most liked movie, pretty much of all time. So
Yeah, those I need to watch as well. And it's honestly, it's crazy looking at Coppola as a director. For a long time I thought he was just like almost like not a one hit wonder, because Godfather Part 1 and Part 2 were so good, but I thought it was really Apocalypse Now and the Godfather movies, and then there was not much else. But it just seems like he has a really wide array of what he's able to kind of tell. And it's not going to be for everyone. Like those movies are, more accessible for a large number of people. But it's really neat to see a director like that that's able to hit such success and popularity and box office success kind of dive into these deeper, more art house films that aren't quite as accessible.
Yeah, and he's actually still making movies recently. They didn't have good ratings when I looked at them. But yeah, he's surprisingly still been making films, and so is his daughter. If you've seen that movie Lost in Translation, pretty good one.
I color me shocked because I honestly thought Francis Ford Coppola was past filmmaking age and maybe even possibly had literally passed away. But that's insane. Yeah, I didn't know he was still making films, and I was aware that I think it's Sofia Coppola.
Yeah.
I did know that yeah, people love Lost in Translation, and I think she came out with one relatively recently that's supposedly pretty good too. But I'll have to check all of the Coppola movies out just because it I guess it runs in the genes, that successful filmmaking gene.
Maybe partly that, and also partly he could get her a. He could probably do a good job of getting his daughter a job.
Yeah, well, that is something that's really coming to the public eye. I don't know if you saw this, Matt, but there was a article about Timothy Chalamet has not had to audition for a role in 5 years. Have you heard this? Do you know who Timothy Chalamet is?
Oh, of course I know who he is, but I had not heard about that. That's surprising.
And they kind of rolled it into nepotism, which I wasn't like completely familiar with the definition of it. I thought it always related to like using familial influences to progress you career wise, but I guess it can also relate to just using connections in general within the industry. And I'm not saying Timothy Chalamet like leverage those whatsoever, but it's like the perpetuation of using people who have like an image of being good, whether it's because they did this that was good, or they're related to someone who did something successfully, and using that, which is obviously awesome if you get to leverage it, but it's like a really interesting topic that's going in Hollywood as to if that is limiting the chances or opportunities of people who are kind of outside of that sphere, and if it's not leading to the best possible person getting every job.
Oh yeah, nepotism. Well, I think you were right about your initial thoughts on nepotism. I think that has to be familial, but maybe I'm wrong. But the whole using your connections, at least the people I've met that went to film school and people I know that are involved in what I've read, that seems to be the most important thing. Like if you have connections, absolutely no reason you would need to get a degree if you wanted to be an actor. I mean, I think it's going, if you do a good job, it's going to, get you more roles, but also I think there's that part where maybe current age, if you can go viral or be some kind of celebrity on your own, removed from the movie, that helps. And also, I think that at this point, or anyone who becomes like a super A-lister, like Timothy Chalamet is probably the most famous actor that's around our age. Um, I don't even think you need to audition more. But yeah, the industry plants and people that use their connections to work their way up, I think are probably the most common types of people in the film industry.
And like the way that current Hollywood production in the film industry looks like, you're looking for the sure thing more often than not, just because of how big an investment every film is. So I think it's something that we're going to see just increase in frequency more and more, where only proven actors, only actors who have been in other box office successes, and only, I guess, franchises that have been successful are going to perpetually be made. And hopefully, streaming services allow an avenue for unproven quantities as far as actors and actresses, and then also like IPs, original tales, original stories being told, have that outlet. But honestly, I think unless there's a huge change, I think movie theaters are going to be mostly playing something that's within a series that you're familiar with. Like in 10 and 20 years, that's probably all that you're going to see in movie theaters, at least from my outlook of where we're currently at.
Yeah, I hope that's not the case. But I think part of the reason maybe Chalamet could get so many offers is because he's in a like a diverse array of movies. Like I haven't seen some of these, but I've seen he's in Dune, which is kind of a series on its own, and then he's in that Call Me by Your Name movie, and he's in a few other popular movies, and then uh I think like Tom Holland is someone that's around his age, and from what I've seen so far, he's kind of been stuck in the Spider-Man role. There's some actors that I don't know if it's their acting ability or if it's their ability to network or if they just get lucky, but it seems like some actors get stuck in a series. Like the original Tobey Maguire, he
Mm,
wasn't really in much besides Spider-Man. So who knows if it's like the acting skill or what it is that gets them role, or maybe they just make their money and they're like, I don't want to do this anymore, you know?
yeah, which honestly, like, it's surprising because I think a lot of people, like you and I, look at cinema as some like almost like something we're super passionate about, and it's just like, had we been in the same shoes, it would be something that's like very artistic in nature that we want to like build build upon and try to make a great piece after great piece after great piece. But it kind of is illuminating on the different outlooks. Like people look at it as a profession sometimes as well. It's kind of neat to see the differing perspectives, or perhaps it's just that's how it turned out, and that's not, they don't really have options outside of that. Maybe because of ability, talent, the like.
Yeah, yeah. It's probably also much different when it becomes your profession. I think, I would always, if I were in it, be excited to come up with new ideas, but I can't imagine the work and, stress and everything when you're trying to make that idea become a reality, years worth, and then maybe not even getting the product you want. There's just a lot of little details that we don't know just because we've never been in the film industry too. And I always try and think of that when I think, oh, I want to maybe direct a movie or something one day. I got to think how much time and effort it takes.
Yeah, that's true. There's a lot behind the scenes that you're not aware of. We just kind of skip the finished product. It's like what's the old saying? You never want to eat sausage after you see how the sausage is made.
I haven't heard that, but yeah, yeah.
Well, Matt, I want to thank you for joining me. This was an awesome discussion. Definitely helped me kind of look at Rumblefish a lot differently. And then Kids was a movie I was like ecstatic to talk about because there was so much. Just it's a very provocative movie first and foremost, and there's so much meat on the bone. I guess what I'm trying to say is Kids was awesome to talk about, and Rumblefish, there was so much more to talk about this than what I thought about immediately after watching. So thanks for talking to me about these movies.
Yeah, I think we had a great discussion today. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely, and thank you for joining us. I appreciate the watch. Be sure to like and subscribe, and we will catch you on the flippity flip. Bye, y'all.